So we have a really long program, and I really do ask you to try to keep the time limit, because otherwise the last person will start their presentation at 10 o'clock in the evening, and that's really not fair towards that person. So please, when you do speak, try to keep your time limit. I will remind you if you don't. So you have approximately 15 minutes to speak, and then 5 minutes for question and answer, except for our keynote speaker, Professor Ian D. Rotherham from Sheffield. And without further ado, I will give the word over to Ian, please.
Good afternoon, and welcome to this presentation on the historical utilisation of trees and woods. My name is Ian Rotherham. I'm Emeritus Professor at Sheffield Hallam University in England. I'd just like to thank the organisers for the invitation to make this presentation to you, and I hope it's both enjoyable and informative. I'm going to look at historical utilisation of trees and woods and look at contemporary cultural values and raise some serious issues in terms of current management and conservation of the heritage resources. Trees, woods and forests are amazingly rich landscapes. They relate to us in many levels, physically, emotionally, psychologically and ecologically. Hugely important to humans over the whole period of our evolution, and they remain important to us today for many, many reasons. A lot of those reasons are not obvious to people enjoying a woodland or a forest or other sorts of treescapes, but they are there nevertheless. Historically, woods and forests have provided resources: timber, wood, turf, peat, stone, clay, reed, bracken. These resources that went into everyday life until relatively recently, in what you might describe as the modern industrialized urban era. That wonderful timber frame house there in England, perhaps in the 1500s, is manufactured from that local landscape. It's a dramatic example, if you like, of dependence on very local resources. So there it is. It's certainly at that point survived several centuries, but was probably built, I would estimate, around about the 1500s. And it was reflecting and utilizing the materials available in that locale. And a local treescape, such as a park or forest, be hugely important to people. For the poor person, it provided fuel and necessary resources. In England, in many situations when the parks enclosed the common land to provide ownership and resources and pleasure to the lord of the manor or to the crown, then the local people still had access to gather by hook or by crook. In other words, you could pull things off with a shepherd's crook or with a hook, or you could gather things that had fallen, and this would be the mainstay of your survival in terms of fuel and maybe small building material. These trees have been pollarded. They're fantastic old trees, pollarded as a high coppice routinely, perhaps every 15 or 20 years, and they are harvested as an ecocultural resource. And we see here another example of biocultural resources and an ecocultural landscape. This is Burnham Beeches outside London in England. And essentially we have this amazing landscape of pollard veteran trees. The pollarding extends in life. And these trees are providing for many centuries, essentially a fuel allotment for the growing city of London. So it's surrounded by these amazing treescapes. And they survive today and are now amongst our most precious conservation iconic resources. The evidence I'm going to make the paper about is based on site archaeology, archival sources, oral histories, and ecological field survey, including of what we call worked trees like those I've just shown that historically worked for a living, and also botanical indicators of habitat continuity and ancient woodland status. And what I've been doing over a number of years is developing detailed timelines from Doomsday to the 21st century for individual sites. And I've listed some papers at the end where these results have been published, because I don't intend to present that information today. Site assessments and evaluations are used to evaluate contemporary site management, which is often undertaken as nature conservation projects. So here we have a typical ancient woodland full of relatively even-aged trees in this case, because this is a landscape that will have been in part replanted by the Victorians, harvested as timber, but also over centuries harvested as wood, with timber extracted from the standard trees in between the coppice stools. And it has a rich resource of earthworks linking to earlier usage and human habitation, and of indicator species that have survived down through the centuries because of the unique conditions within those traditionally managed woodlands. And yet, this is not, it's not recognised. This biocultural heritage leads to untold damage, and often inadvertent, unknowing damage to both archaeology and biocultural heritage of worked trees and vegetation. This is a wonderful ancient woodland on the border of Derbyshire in Middle England, and it's even managed by our own Forestry Commission. It's a very historic landscape, major archaeological features, and very rich biodiversity. And this is what we do. It makes it absolutely crazy. And yet at the same time, we know that UK ancient woodlands and forest landscapes result from long-term utilisation and management to create these amazingly impressive and rich ground floras of species adapted to woodland conditions. These are eco-cultural landscapes. These reflect humanity and nature interacting in predictable ways, usually over many, many centuries. The biocultural heritage, which results from usage, is well established. So examples like this amazing coppice small leaf lime stool. Assuming this is all one tree, that is undoubtedly well over 1,000 years old. That's an absolutely amazing example of biocultural heritage. Or this is the human footprint. This is the base of a potash burner's hut in Cumbria in the English Lake District. You can see the entrance here, the base. There would have been poles, cut wood up to a wigwam shape, and there's even a little fireplace and hearth in that side there. So this was where itinerant woodland workers resided when they were out on site for months at a time. So we're very interested in both process and product. The product here is charcoal. This is an engraving from the 1700s, and it shows the charcoal stack being produced, where the base of a stack is going to be, and the center pole, a charcoal burn taking place, and even the burner's little wheelbarrow, his typical wooden rake, and other wooden tools that they have. There's stacks of cordwood, dry and ready to process. So very, very, really good insight into what's actually happening in this landscape. And we know that this went on in a very, very similar way right the way back to Roman times. So this is a process that's been passed on as an oral tradition, as oral heritage, right the way down for over 2,000 years. I find that absolutely amazing. And here in the 1800s, this is a charcoal burner's hut with turf cut from the vegetation nearby. There'll be poles under that to provide the structure, a basic door, a little porch, and then it's made weatherproof by cut turf hanging over the poles. and there's ventilation provided there. So that's from the New Forest in England. So historical utilisation generated contemporary cultural values, things that we value today. And these are both intangible and tangible biocultural heritage, oral traditions, physical artefacts. So there we have a besom maker, typical besom maker. Here we have a charcoal burner's hut with the whole family there in the Royal Lancashire show. So that may have been a reconstruction. I don't think it is. I'm not sure about that, whether that's actually a souvenir of the show, but actually taken from the real-time landscape. It looks like they're actually charcoal burners. And they're clog makers, traditional older clog makers, were the other woodworkers in the wood and in the forest. And every craft, every occupation left a distinctive mark. The hut circles, the remains of the older clog workers, the charcoal men, the besom men, the woodworkers, the coppice men, the barkers, etc., all have different dwellings, they all have different social structures, and they leave a different mark in the landscape. The whole process was driven by people and animals. So we have a whole set of people who were involved in working the woodlands. Here they're actually taking the cut timber out, carried by shire horses on traditional carts. And we see the remnant of this history in our culture today with things like family names, surnames. So the Cartwright family, the Cartwrights would have been the people that were responsible for making and servicing the carts. And the same with the wheelwrights and all sorts of other workers in this traditional landscape. And they have a young lad tending the horse and about to remove some very substantial timbers. And it's also left a hollow way, a root way into the working wood. Here, an early engraving of charcoal burners, again in the New Forest. And you can see the burn underway, the screens to protect the burn from adverse wind conditions, the burner's hut, the stacks of cordwood, etc., etc. So we get some sort of insight into what these people are doing in these amazing landscapes. There is more in this little book on ancient woodland history, industry and crafts, if anybody is interested. And I'm interested in the whole process of these things right the way across Europe and beyond. And there's a great commonality. So here we see charcoal burning in Germany around about the 1900s. And then in the 1930s. I wouldn't actually fancy being the man stood in the middle of it. That could be quite a dangerous occupation if you were to slip through into the red hot ash inside the burn. But you can see this is different sorts of wood. This is a dense, even-aged conifer wood. So sometimes the process and even the product vary depending where we are in the landscape. And of course, what happens is we get cultural severance. We get a breakdown in traditional management. And this is largely to do with changes during the 19th century and into the 20th century, which then trigger an end of traditional uses of many of these crafts, but then the progressive loss of traditional knowledge and cultural memories. So what we see is a landscape changing from a traditional landscape of common land and traditionally managed woods, again within forests and parks, etc., into a landscape of more intensive farming, of enclosure of common land, and in the wider landscape a move to hunting of game, and therefore the prohibition of local people in that same landscape. And one of the reactions to that is to litter those now managed woods, managed by gamekeepers, managed as coverts, managed for game shooting for the rich and the the famous, if you like, the powerful in society, and to stop the peasants now coming into the keepered woods, you would actually set man traps like this one here, and that was perfectly legal. And if you had a problem with that when you were injured, maybe trespassing in the site which had been your common land, then the court would be adjudicated by the local lord of the manor, whose woodland it was and whose gamekeepers had actually set the traps in the first place. We have all the associated processing. We have the product, we have the processing that goes on. So here we have various people sawing timber at different stages. That's already been squared. But the thing here is the cultural resonance that we have. They're a great timber that will be rolled down towards the man in the pit. This is a saw pit. In the woodland itself, you get small saw pits. In the wider landscape, the bigger saw pits for processing the timber. And the guy down here is the underdog, and the guy up here is the top dog. He gets all the sawdust in his eyes and he has to pull very, very hard. So those are things that still are preserved in our language today, even though most people have no idea where that came from. And you also get, again, family names such as Sawyer, so the man who operated the saw. The cultural heritage is really very, very interesting. This is a picture I use in my little book on ancient woodlands. And I then had correspondence with a lady called Julie Cook, whose family name was Harbour, and Thomas Harbour here was his great-great-granddad. This is pictured in the early 1900s. And she was researching the family history for something that she was writing, and she'd seen my picture. And since then, we managed to find other pictures of great-great-grandfather Thomas Harbour. So sometimes you get these amazing little bits of cultural heritage passed down through the generations. Oral histories and memories and connections can be fantastic. These landscapes and their trees result from people-nature interactions over centuries, generating eco-cultural heritage. So here we have a deer park boundary, which later becomes a woodland boundary. Totally collapsed, it would have been quite a substantial wall. It's now a stone bank and ditch. And there we have a great pollard tree in Cumbria. And of course, because these ancient trees are living organisms, they may sometimes get to a point where they collapse and die. So there is an issue with biocultural heritage that sometimes it is time limited. In this case, what's happened is that the cultural usage has ended. Maybe 50 years previously, the pollard tree has carried on growing, become overtopped, and then it got taken out in a great storm, which on that hillside took out about a third of the great pollard trees in one storm event. So cultural severance is a breakdown between nature and people in a subsistence interaction. And we get the twin changes of abandonment and industrialisation of forestry. So we get, on the one hand, abandonment of traditional utilisation. And you have to bear in mind that these, what are often now conservation sites, these were working industrial sites that would be almost unrecognisable to a visitor today. But the footprint, the mark of these people in that landscape over centuries is now there as really important heritage. And it's reflected in not just the soils and the humps and bumps, but also in the vegetation. It reflects these processes and these people. So very, very important. And there's very, very little real awareness of how central that interaction of people and nature is in terms of generating what we have today. And one of the key things is that this is powered by people and it's powered by animals, oxen, ponies, horses, not by big machines. It's not petrochemically subsidized. So we get abandonment and loss. And what that means is that the evidence in the archives within the wood, within the forest, are blurred and at worst erased. And this is what people like the tanners. I said each cultural usage, each craft had a distinctive approach, distinctive huts, distinctive behaviour. And they would come in sequence to a woodland that's been worked to take the different products. So the bark will be stripped from the coppice and from the great trees as a very valuable crop for tanning, for the tanning leather industry. And that would happen before anything else was done. And then the trees and the debarked coppice would be left and then cut as appropriate. We have landscape artifacts in the situation here, early blast furnace, a charcoal hearth, a quernstone. Some of this is archaeology today. Here we have a cup and ring marked stone from the Bronze Age, absolutely irreplaceable. If you see that, it looks like a well-groomed toy poodle, and it's been abandoned by, it's been adopted by the current generation of people in the woodland as the poodle stone. This was a symbolic stone for Bronze Age cultures. And it might be the working tree. This is the big belly oak at Savernake. Abandonment triggers successional ecological changes, loss of cultural memories, and cultural severance. So it has an impact on iconic species like the bluebell, Hyacinthoides. Now, bluebell is interesting because actually when you get dominant bluebell landscapes, as we have in many parts of England, what that's telling me, reading the landscape, is of abandonment of traditional management when the bluebells would have been far less prevalent because they don't cope with all the trampling and the bashing and the horses and the animals and the people. So they'd be there, but not in abundance. They do very well when the woodland is abandoned from traditional management and as a canopy closes, as a coppice wood is again abandoned. So we can interpret these indicators quite cleverly in terms of landscape history. And then cultural severance becomes a major driver of ecological change, and in some cases, biodiversity decline. We can see here an abandoned pollard in a parkland landscape. Huge regrowth, and we can actually core these to actually date when they were last cut, and that probably is about 200 years ago. So it's a veteran tree, last harvested in its traditional way 200 years ago. And there is a problem because as those branches get bigger and bigger, they will undoubtedly ultimately collapse and break the tree up. So you can see some examples here. There's a collapsing pollard. You can see the massive regrown stems, and you're damned if you do, damned if you don't, because it's very hard to repollard these, because what you tend to do, but when they've got to this stage, is the tree goes into shock and will probably die. And then we've got a feature here. This is in the Whitwell Wood that I showed earlier, an amazing site with a huge bank and ditch system extending around about a mile, with enclosures and other buildings and features associated with it. And we don't know what age that is. It's a massive feature and it's extensive. It's probably Dark Ages. Could be earlier. But this is what we've done to it. This is what the Forestry Commission has done to it. They've put machines right through that historic landscape. And not only that, the actual landscape, when you've got that bank and ditch, that is telling you that the wider landscape is also a cultural landscape of that date or earlier. So it's not just the bank and ditch that you can see, it's the entire landscape, which is full of earthworks, other features, pits, platforms, building sites, post holes, and all sorts of things. And we cast it aside as it has no value at all. This is wood anemone. This is one of our indicator species. I've seen it in places like Norway, where it seems to grow as a weed on roadside verges, on motorways. But in England, it's very tightly associated to ancient landscapes, particularly ancient woodland. And it's part of this eco-cultural landscape heritage linked to the human nature interaction. It's vulnerable and it's easily compromised. And as I say, this is what we do. This is Whitwell Wood again. This is going through one of those wood anemone, wood avens, bluebell landscapes. And it is atrocious, unsustainable management. Now, whilst most of these lands have been working woods, which is what people say, oh, it doesn't matter, these were working woods for much of the history. Yes, they were, but this was powered by men, horses and oxen. One of the big misunderstandings when Oliver Reckham and George Peterkin raised the idea of ancient woodland, people thought that that meant wild wood, which of course it doesn't. It's not a pure wild woodland. It says this eco-cultural landscape, but the eco-cultural landscape goes back probably 1,000 or 2,000 years, and it's powered by people and animals. And it's used traditionally in a predictable way, sometimes intensively, but it's still predictable, and it's not powered by petrol-driven machines. It's not energetically subsidized. So whilst most of these lands have been working woods, they were traditionally managed. The consequence of these changes of modern management frequently equate to the total erasure of landscape and ecological cultural heritage. And it's producing timber in some cases, but the value of the timber does not equate to the value of the damage which is being done to these landscapes. I liken this a little bit like taking York Minster, the famous church in York, demolishing it and using it to make your garden rockery. It's a good source of stone, but so the whole place is littered with warning forestry operations. Please follow all signs and diversions. So we've got this issue about historical management and management today. Ancient woodlands today are, for many reasons, the wrong places to grow timber or to harvest coppice wood. Any work that we are doing should be low impact, genuinely low impact. The result is what I call doodling on the Mona Lisa. Ancient woodlands are historic palimpsests. They're multi-layered landscapes with a patina of antiquity and human history. They have ecological and historical authenticity. But when you start to use big machines instead of animal and human power, you erase the resource. You've still got a painting, it's not as good as it was. We have also incredibly intensive reaction to tree diseases such as Phytophthora. This is a fantastic ancient woodland full of probably medieval and earlier archaeology, none of which has been surveyed or assessed, and they've gone in with big machines. I don't even know if what's been done will halt the spread of the disease. And the issue that I've raised is, well, if it doesn't, and the disease spreads to the 5 or so woodlands adjacent, are you going to clear fell those as well? And they are erasing at one stroke this amazing, irreplaceable human nature landscape. Finally, there's a lack of accepted evaluation processes or effective KITE-marking for sustainable forest products. And this presents significant problems. There are ones about ecological processes and things of that nature, but there's nothing about heritage or cultural heritage. The case studies I present are based largely on England, but the wider issues apply Europe-wide, and irreplaceable heritage is being compromised and eroded. This is a set of medieval and early industrial charcoal hearths, and it's been pretty well trashed by modern machine operations. That was the biggest, oldest tree of its sort, an oak in the United Kingdom. In Wales, the great oak of Pont-Fredog, the last survivor of the great forest that was there in the 1200s. And it blew over a few years back. It would have cost £3,000 to prop it up. We just didn't care enough to do it. We need to be better at this. We need to raise awareness. These are irreplaceable landscapes, and to go through them today and use big machines, high impact, with major wheel impacts and ruts, etc., is totally, totally unacceptable. There's a ancient coppice lime tree. Whether it will survive, I don't know. Some of it came down a windfall, but I don't think the treatment of the rest of it is sustainable or appropriate. It was a unique tree for many, many miles around in Nottinghamshire. That one is National Trust. I just don't think that's the way to do it. lime trees do break up because they naturally coppice, and Donald Piggott has suggested that you just leave them. Again, trackways for vehicle access going right the way through a complex landscape of charcoal hearths, wood banks, ditches, trackways, smelting sites, completely obliterated. So there's a whole load of papers there which give the details, so please do dip into some of those. Most of them are downloadable from my website, the ukeconet.org. And there's more, as I say, on the website, on my blog, Ian's Walk on the Wild Side, and on my Twitter. So I hope that has been informative and enjoyable, and I thank you very much for listening.
This was fascinating. We have time for one short question. Unfortunately, not more at this point. Maybe later, if anybody wants to ask something. You still all have your cameras switched off, which is relatively frustrating, but never mind. So if anyone has a question.
That silenced everybody.
Yes. Anybody? No one wants to ask? Well, we have to move on anyway, so we might as well move on.